Boomer community. This is Wendy Green, and I am your host for Hey Boomer. Well, usually. Today, John Weiss, you all mostly probably remember John Weiss. He is going to help out today because, as you can hear, I don't have much of a voice. I have bronchitis. I have pink eye. I'm a mess. So just like Terry Gross sometimes has somebody stand in for her on Fresh Air, I'm going to have John Weiss stand in for me. And being that John is a former police chief, I'm sure he'll be a good interrogator. Oh, I'm sorry. I mean, interviewer for Richard. And so I'm going to mute myself and let John do the Never Too Old stories and then introduce Richard.
Perfect. Well, Wendy, we all hope that you feel better soon. And I think it's funny that I ended up being a co-host after our technical problems last time. So without any further ado, I'm going to go off on my notes here. Hopefully I'll get everything right. But you're right. Today's guest is Richard Eisenberg. I'm looking forward to hearing about everything he has to say as far as finances go. Such an important topic. Richard Eisenberg recently became unretired after leaving his job as managing editor and editor of the Money and Policy and Work and Purpose channels at the PBS website for people 50 plus, Next Avenue. He is a co-host of the, quote, Friends Talk Money podcast, a book reviewer for People magazine, and author of The Money Book of Personal Finance, and How to Avoid a Midlife Financial Crisis, something we all want to do, is to avoid that. He has been executive editor of Money Magazine, special projects director / money editor of Good Housekeeping, and front page finance editor of Yahoo. He graduated from Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism, and he lives in New Jersey. But before we bring Richard on, we have the Never Too Old stories. We have two very short but good ones that Wendy has put together for us this morning, or this afternoon, depending on where you're listening. The first story, number one. Do you recognize the name Bob Weir? If you're a Deadhead, I know you do. He was a founding member and guitarist with the Grateful Dead. What is he doing now, you ask? Apparently, he is busier now than ever at 74 years young. He is working on a memoir, an opera, and a stage musical about the Negro League ball player Satchel Paige. He is currently on the road with his new band, Bobby Weir and the Wolf Brothers. What a great name. He is also still touring with some of the former Grateful Dead members in a group called Dead and Company. He keeps himself fit and sharp with daily workouts and meditation. He says he needs to stay in shape so he can perform 3-hour shows, which is remarkable at 74. Bob Weir is finding so many opportunities opening up for him at this stage in his life. He said, quote, opportunities are arriving that make life worth living, so I got to go for them. Retiring is not an option. What a great quote. Story number two. You might have read about this gentleman in the news recently. Howard Schultz will now have been CEO of Starbucks 3 times. His first stint as CEO lasted from 1987 to 2000. He then came back in 2008 to help bail the company out of some financial difficulties and retired again in 2018. Now, with the current CEO leaving, it was just announced that Howard Schultz will step in again as interim CEO, and he will again be joining the board of directors. This guy has failed at retirement. He did not plan on returning, but is quoted as saying, when you love something, you have a deep sense of responsibility to help when called. Good for him. Howard Schultz is a superstar CEO and founder, said Sidney Fickelstein, a management professor at Dartmouth College's Tuck Business School. Whether this proves to be a good move for the company or for Mr. Schultz remains to be seen. But at 68, he certainly does not see himself as too old to be leading an international organization. Seeing opportunities and going after them, we are never too old for that, are we, Wendy? You don't have to answer, save your voice. All right, with that, Wendy, why don't we bring on Richard? Well, hello, Richard, welcome.
Hi, John. How are you? Hi, Wendy. So sorry you're not feeling great.
Well, we're thrilled to have you on, Richard, and I'm going to do my best to probe your experience and get some great answers for our listeners this morning. Let's see here. Topics to cover. Money is often a difficult topic to discuss. There are a lot of emotional and ego responses to our relationships with money. I think we'd all agree with that. Why do you think we have so much difficulty talking about money to the people we are closest to, Richard?
Gee, that's a complicated question, John. In some cases, I think it can go back to our childhoods. I think a lot of us grew up in families where people didn't talk about money. Our parents didn't talk about it, certainly not in front of the children. And even as we grew up, often it just wasn't a topic to talk about. And then in society at large, it's been a taboo topic for many years. I mean, even today, most people won't reveal what their salary is, although that's starting to change. People, I think, feel, I don't know, maybe it's a little nervous, maybe a little self-conscious, maybe a little embarrassed about their financial situation, even when they don't need to be. And so it's something that people are a little shy about, but I really hope that shows like this will help people talk about it a little more openly.
Yeah, that's good advice. I just lost my mother this last year in 2021. She was 87. And I'm so
Sorry.
thankful that, thank you, that I had conversations with her over the years after my father's death back in 2004. And we put together a living trust with her, and it just made things so much easier. One of the things that Wendy asked about was having conversations with elderly parents, family members. If this doesn't happen, do you have some suggestions as to how a person might start the conversation?
Yeah, it's so important to do this, but it's so hard to do it too. A lot of families just can't bring themselves to do it. Often the adult child is worried that the parents are going to think it's ghoulish, or that the parents are going to think the child is, out for their money.
Right.
Sometimes the parents are concerned about how much they should reveal to their children, and so they just don't bring it up. But as you say, John, it can be so helpful to do it, particularly while your parents are well enough that you can hold a real conversation with them. Too often, what happens is that the adult children don't have the conversation, and then sadly, the parents get dementia or Alzheimer's. That happened in my
Right.
family. And at that point, not only is it too late to talk about it, it's often too late to find out the things you really need to know, down to, you know, who's your lawyer, who's your financial advisors, where are your accounts. Not that you're going to take their money, but that you need to know where it is so that you can manage it for them. And if you don't have those conversations early, you just don't know what the future is going to hold.
Yeah, that's true. I know in the case of my father, he was an administrative law judge, really intellectual guy. You think that an attorney and a law judge would have all that worked out in advance, but he really didn't, And when he was in his 80s, he started to have failing health, and it was sort of a last minute thing that my mother and I managed to get. I got a durable power of attorney and things like that for health. Thank God, because then he fell into that fog of dementia, and I had to suddenly start making decisions for him. And I'm so glad that we had that legal instrument in place. Another
Let me
fault.
let me let me ask something too, John.
Yes.
So, Richard, if your parents are concerned that you're going to take advantage of them or something like that, are there other avenues you can take to try and start the conversation somehow?
Yeah, there are a few things you can do. Well, one is for you to explain that that's not what you're trying to do. What you're trying to do is be helpful for them, so that if there ever comes a time where they need somebody to help manage their accounts, that you can step in for them. So I think you want to put them at ease to let them know why you're trying to do this. But sometimes it's helpful to have a third party, to get a trusted advisor who they feel more comfortable talking with. Maybe they have a lawyer or an accountant, or some other financial advisor that they have already shared this kind of information with. And maybe it's the time where you get to meet that person and maybe have a conversation, the three of them. And if not, maybe you have them talk to that advisor, and then that advisor talks to you.
Yeah, that's good advice. That way they feel more at ease knowing there's a third party. What about
Yeah.
going the other direction, Richard? What about having these conversations with your children when you're older? Do you have children, and how do you start that conversation with them without making them feel, uncomfortable or frightened even?
Yes. Well, my wife and I have two sons, grown sons. They're in their early 30s. They live in California. We live in New Jersey. And it's something I've been thinking a lot about. We've started to have some preliminary conversations. They don't like to hear us talk about it very much because to them, it makes them think that there's going to be a day when we're not here and they don't want to think about that, they say. But what I'm trying to explain to them is we just want them to know what they need to know so that should they ever need to take over for us or we're not here, they can do that. So we're not having conversations with specifics about here's how much money we have and all of our investments. It's more about generally speaking, we've invested in these kinds of things. This is the advisor that we use. This is where our will is. This is the bank account that we have and our brokerage accounts, so that when they need to, if they need to, they'll know what to do next. There may come a point where we'll want to be more specific with them, or they'll want us to, and we'll do that. But we don't feel like we're quite there yet.
Yeah, but you've already started that process, which is really important. I know in our house, we have a big red binder in our safe. My son's 23 now, but he knows the combination of the safe and everything is laid out in there, including the letter for me, who to contact, who our financial advisor is, everything. So if we got run over by a turnip truck tomorrow, he knows what to do.
There was a book that you mentioned too, Richard.
Yeah, sorry, thanks, Wendy. Yeah, there's a really good book I wanted to tell your audience about. It's called Mom and Dad, We Need to Talk. The author is Cameron Huddleston. She's a really terrific financial journalist. And this is the subtitle of the book says it all. Is How to Have Essential Conversations with Your Parents About Their Finances. And she has a lot of good advice about how to do it, when to do it, what to talk about, that sort of thing. So I feel like sometimes it's useful to get a book like that. You can get it from the public library or you can buy it, and that may give you some advice. One other thing, John, I would mention is for people who have spouses or partners, it's so important for each of them to have conversations with each other, but also to literally write down, these are my bank accounts and these are my account numbers. These are the passwords to my computer and my digital accounts, because there may come a time where one of you needs to step in for the other. And the worst thing that can happen at that point is if they don't know what you have or how to get to them, and then they're just flummoxed. You want to avoid that from happening. So as silly as it may sound, having a list for them of your passwords and your accounts can come in really handy one day.
Well, that's a really good tip. I might have to go check our binder to see if we have that in there, because it's stressful enough when you lose someone you love, but then to have to suddenly deal with all these other issues can be overwhelming. Okay, next question. Many people in the over 50 age group are in a second marriage or are considering second marriages. That brings up conversations of a prenup, adult children, who's responsible for what. What are some of the pitfalls you have seen in these situations, and how do you suggest they should be addressed?
Yeah, that gets even more complicated once you start having blended families, and there can sometimes be some rivalries and some turf battles. As Wendy and you said, I've been the managing editor at Next Avenue and the money editor there, and we published some stories about this. So I would encourage people to go to Next Avenue and do a search for the articles about blended families and estate planning. But what I would say there is, again, the more you can have these conversations in advance and explain, these are my wishes. This is what I'm planning to do. Here's who I want to get what from our estate. They may not be happy with all those decisions. They may not like them, but it's better for them to know about it early on. And also maybe for them to know early enough so that if they feel strongly that they feel that's not right, or there's something that you own that they really have a sentimental attachment to that you never knew, it's good to have that conversation early, because maybe you want to then change your final wishes and your instructions in your will to say that my daughter or son or daughter-in-law or stepson will get X because it's more important to them than you thought it was.
Yeah, and that's a good point. These things can be pretty challenging. What about siblings? One of the questions here is, siblings are another group where money conversations may be difficult. There's two scenarios. One might be an unmarried sibling who has not shared any information about their wishes when they die. this could be particularly difficult to bring up.
Well, in that case, it's not all that different from what we were talking about before about having these conversations with your parents. In this case, if you've got a brother or sister who has never talked to you and you've never talked with them about your finances and they feel reluctant to do it, again, I think you want to explain the only reason you want to have this conversation is because there may come a time where somebody needs to step in to manage their finances. And because they don't have a spouse or a partner, and you want to be sure that their wishes are carried out and things are done that need to get done, and that they can do the same for you if need be. So, that's an important conversation. Sometimes it gets complicated when you've got brothers and sisters, and particularly if they don't all agree on how to help take care of your parents or when to help look for a new place for your parents to live or managing their finances, or after a death, who's going to be in charge, that sort of thing. It's really helpful, I feel, in cases like that to have conversations with all of your brothers and sisters and together, but at least individually, and sort of assign duties and say, well, you'll be in charge of doing this because either you're better at it or you live closer to them, and I'll be in charge of that. And I feel like the more you can parcel out who's responsible for what, the less you're going to run into problems later on where people are pointing fingers saying, oh, I thought you were going to do that, or that's not how we should have done it, that sort of thing. Now, it's not going to guarantee that there won't be disputes or disagreements. They may still happen, but you can ward off some of them by having some conversations early on.
Yeah, we got a little bit of feedback there from your mic, but then it cleared up again. So I think it's just something we'll have to struggle with as we go along here. So bear with us, listeners. Another scenario is when one sibling is an executor, and another one is not. That's the case with, like, my sister and I was the executor because I lived closer to my mother, just was more convenient. But what would you suggest in this situation as far as when questions come up about the estate?
It's a tricky situation. If you are named the executor, you have the authority and the responsibility to make the decisions. You were selected, you were appointed to do that. And you just want your siblings to understand that this was a role that you were asked to do, and you're going to do it to the best of your abilities. Now, if they have other ideas and think that they can do it better or just as well as you can, you should, ask for their suggestions. But ultimately, you're the one who's got to make the final decisions, and it's going to be up to you. And hopefully they'll agree with you. If they don't, it's unfortunate, but, that's just the way the system works if there's one executor.
Yeah, I know one of the tricky things too is, like in my case, I discussed it with my mother and her attorney, and we shared with my sister everything. We sent her a copy of what was in the trust and what was in her will, so there was no surprises. But in some families that may not be a good option. That maybe there are surprises, or maybe the one person says, "Hey, I don't want anyone to know what my plans are until after I'm gone." So that's where it can be tricky. So having those conversations is important. There are situations where shame may prevent a conversation from happening. None of us want to admit that maybe we've made some bad financial decisions. I'm sure, Richard, you've had plenty of clients and people who are recovering from some bad decisions and trying to make some changes. What have you seen in your writings and research that might make it easier for someone to admit they need some help?
Well, nobody's perfect, and we all make mistakes with our finances, and sometimes there are events that happen that we weren't expecting that change our finances for the worse, and we have to make the best of it. Some of us, we lose jobs, or the stock market goes down. Things can happen, and I would encourage people not to feel shame about this sort of thing. To just understand that it happens to everybody, and the more you can just deal with it and live with the situation and figure out the best way to get out of it as best as you can. Sometimes that means meeting with a financial advisor who can help you get out of problems you have. If you have a debt problem, it might mean meeting with a credit counselor. Don't feel that you have to do it on your own. It's often better to do it with somebody who's more of an expert than you are, who has more time than you do.
Yeah, that's good advice, because I know some people can be really embarrassed if they made bad choices and they don't want to bring it up. And sometimes you got to be careful how you bring up issues like that. I know that my parents were very open and we discussed things. More so my mother and I. My dad used to handle everything. But fortunately, he made, for the most part, good decisions. So we didn't have any tough conversations.
Let me, yeah. So Richard, you started out with a career in journalism, but you've been focused on money most of the time. How did that happen?
Well, my first job out of journalism school was as a fact checker at Money Magazine. I was lucky to get that position. I didn't know very much about personal finances then, not that many people in the early 20s do. And so I learned a lot very quickly and over the years, which led me to become a writer and an editor at all the places that you've mentioned. So, and I've had the great ability and fortune to be able to speak to some very smart people over the years who knew a lot more than I did about things like taxes and personal finances, investing. And I could then share their wisdom with readers for the magazines and the websites that I worked for. So that's part of the fun about being a journalist, is you get to talk to a lot of people who know a lot and then can tell others what you now know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you have a
So, yeah. So, all that you've learned and all that you have reported on, does that make these conversations any easier for you with your family?
I wouldn't say it makes them easy, but I would say it makes it easier because I've seen and written about mistakes that people have made by not having these conversations. So I feel like I'm more familiar with the downsides of not talking it over, and can then pass it on to my children and my wife and our parents about why I'm doing it. And I can point to other people that I've interviewed or writers that I've edited, have talked to and said, well, here's what happened when they didn't do that, or this is a problem that can arise. And I think that by explaining that it's not just about us, it's about a lot of people who are going through this, and here's the kind of things that can be helpful, has been useful, I think, to make it a little bit easier for my family to understand the importance of doing it. It's not just me talking, it's a lot of the experts I've talked to talking to them through me.
Yeah. Yeah. Richard, one of the things that I consider myself sort of an armchair minimalist. As I got older and after my father passed away, I had to downsize a lot of the things in my parents' home. And so I learned a lot from that about what's important and what's not. And then when I moved from California to Las Vegas, we downsized a bit. We actually got the same size house, but we got rid of a lot of things we didn't need. Can you talk to me a little bit about when people retire? What are some prudent decisions they should make about, their home, where they should live, the things that they own, or do the things own them? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Oh, sure. There's a lot to unpack there. One of the articles that I wrote for Next Avenue that turned out to be one of the most popular articles the site has ever published was called "Sorry, Nobody Wants Your Parents' Stuff." And I wrote this article from a very personal place. My father had just passed away. My sister and I were in the position of having to quickly find ways to empty the apartment that my father and my late mother had lived in. They didn't have a lot, but they had an apartment, and they lived in an independent living community. And the manager of that community wanted to rent that apartment as quickly as they could. So we suddenly had to very quickly figure out what to do with their stuff. And what we found, sadly, but I think a lot of people are finding out, was it's much harder these days to find places and people who will want these things than it used to be. It used to be that there were a lot of antique dealers and charities that would be happy to take furniture and clothes. And these days, there are many fewer of them. A lot of antique stores will say, we don't want dining room tables, we don't want break fronts, we don't have room for it, there's no market for that. I've heard people say, we don't want brown furniture, because that describes what this is all about. And that was the case for us. And we ended up keeping my parents' dining room table and chairs. We hadn't planned to, but we just felt like that was the best place for them. But there were other things that we had to, essentially, take to a junk place because nobody wanted them. We were able to auction off some of the pieces of art that my parents had. They didn't have very much, and one piece wasn't worth anything. Nobody wanted it, but another was worth something. Sometimes you don't know till you start trying. So I would say It helps to see if there's anybody else in your family who might want the things that you or your parents have, and you may get lucky. In some cases you will, but in many cases you won't. And then when you can, then you can start looking to see if there's anybody you can give it to, any charities. But you may just find that you need to possibly sell them if you can on eBay and places like that. But more likely you may have to junk them. So it's a sad situation, but it's the reality for a lot of people. You also have where to live, and I just wrote a piece on sorry, calling for the website Market Watch. And
sorry, Richard, your audio is getting a little bit garbled again, and maybe mine is too. I don't know, Wendy, can you hear me okay on your end?
Richard, did you mute?
I'll mute.
Okay,
I don't know if.
There you go.
How about
okay.
now? Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you. Okay, Richard, we lost you around talking about how sad it is to not be able to give away your stuff, parent stuff.
Can you hear? Should I keep trying, John, or do you want me to stop?
I can. Yes.
So I would just say the more you can try to early start looking for family members or places that might want the things that your parents have or that you have, the better off you're going to be, because otherwise you may find yourself having to do what we have to do, which is to essentially give a lot of it to a junk dealer, which is sad to have to do. You also asked about where to live, and I just wrote an article for Market Watch. I'm now a columnist for them, writing a column called The View from Unretirement, and I just wrote a piece about how to figure out where to retire. And as your audience probably knows, there are a lot of rankings of best places to retire. And I was amazed after I looked through 14 of them that almost every one of them had a different best place to retire. And that's largely because they all use very different methodologies. And sometimes the methodology makes sense and sometimes it doesn't. But it's often not the methodology that you would have chosen yourself, because we all have particular preferences about what matters to us. So I would say look at those rankings, but really pay attention to how they do their methodology and whether they are putting into factoring what really matters to you. And if they're not, or if they're including things that you don't care about, then either take it with a grain of salt or just don't bother with that. I really find it helps, as we've been doing for my wife and I, to start doing some visits, going to places where you think you might want to retire, and spend some time there. Spend a week or two if you can, or more if you can. If you can do it a few times during the year, different seasons, try to do it so you can see what is it like to be a resident, not what is it like to be a tourist. Right. Because if you're there for just a day or two and you're in a hotel, you really don't have an idea of what it's like to live there. But if you're there for a few weeks and you live there like somebody else does, maybe you rent out an Airbnb, you can start saying, oh, I would like to live here. Or this is very walkable, or it's not at all walkable, or it doesn't have what I'm looking for. The people aren't people that I would want to spend time with. So I'd say do your research, what's called desktop research, and do what's called, in-person visits.
Yeah, that's great advice. I've known people who romanticized another state where they thought they wanted to live. And then, it's one thing to vacation somewhere, but when you live there through the seasons, when it's snowing, or you find that they don't have the amenities you thought that they had, or there's not the medical establishments you need, and also just moving away from maybe where your career was, where you've known people your whole life, or there might be family. Those things, I think, need to weigh into the decision about relocating. Maybe more affordable to move somewhere, but you may find yourself marooned in a place that isn't as idyllic as you thought.
And part of the challenge is that people move to be near their kids, because their kids have relocated for careers. But they're early in their careers and they relocate again, and there you are.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And I think you also want to think about what kind of a home do I want? My wife and I, we live in New Jersey now. We expect that we will move to Los Angeles at some point. Our grown sons are there, but they're in the entertainment business, and I think that's where they're going to stay. They may live in different parts of Los Angeles, but I think they'll stay in Los Angeles. That's what they've told us. But we decided that when we make the move, we want to live in a condominium with no steps. We're perfectly fine with steps right now, but we saw what our parents have gone through, and how hard they had dealing with mobility, and we just think that that could happen one day, and we'd like to make a move one day where we won't need to move again. So we'd rather find a place that we feel we can age and place into. So I think you want to look at the neighborhood, the community, and also what type of residence you want.
Yeah, that makes sense. I know where I live here in Henderson, which is right next to Las Vegas, is a place called Sun City Anthem, and the homes are all single story. They were designed with the idea of retirement, so that you don't have to fight stairs and things like that. I was thinking too about when I go into town, Richard. Sometimes I see folks that are in their late 60s, 70s, maybe older, who are working. Some maybe in the local Walgreens. And people often talk about ageism. If you retired and maybe you find yourself needing a little extra to make your life in retirement more comfortable, it can be hard to dive back into the work world, particularly if you came from a place where you had a title or a profession where you were respected, and now you're retired and you're not in that field anymore. Can you talk a little bit about that? About what are things you should think about if you need to supplement your income, if you want to go back into the work world? How does that work for people?
Well, I understand what you're saying, but I would say that these days it's easier to do that kind of transition because so many jobs can be done remotely, so you can do a lot of jobs anywhere, and you may not stay in the field that you were in before, but there's a tight labor market right now. There are a lot of employers that need workers, and they are looking at workers of all ages. And so even if you've never done that before, they may be willing to train you, so you can learn how to do it. You may be able to do what you were doing before full time and now do it part time as a consultant or some other kind of professional. I retired from Next Avenue when I had a full time job. Now I call myself unretired or semi retired. I'm still writing for Next Avenue sometimes, and I'm writing for Market Watch sometimes. I'm in a field where I can do that, and I'm fortunate that people are allowing me to do it. I'd say a lot of more people can probably do it than may give themselves credit for. And sometimes people want to work partly for the money, but partly because they just like the stimulation of work and they enjoy working and keeping their brain active, and also the sociability of it. Sometimes just being around people, either in person or virtually. So there's lots of reasons why people may want to work. And I'm not saying everybody can necessarily easily find a job, but I think it's easier than it was a few years ago.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think a lot of people work because they want to get out of the house and be around other people and not feel as lonely. So that makes sense too. I had another question I want to ask you too, and I was thinking about it when you were talking, and I lost it. I don't know, Wendy, how are we doing on time? Can you chime?
Yeah, I think we're doing okay. We probably could have one more question. And it's, since we're talking about the conversations about money, Richard, I think we've talked about conversations up, conversations down, right? To our parents, to our kids, to our siblings. Do you ever find that it's helpful to talk to your friends about how they are handling these conversations? Do they give you more insight or courage or ideas?
I think it's a great point, Wendy. I do think you can learn a lot by asking friends, particularly about how they dealt with their parents or their adult children when they want to have these conversations. I think it's hard to have a conversation with your friends about their finances or your finances. People still feel often reluctant to do that. But I think people are very eager to share what they've been going through and maybe get ideas from each other. And so your friend can say, well, my father didn't want to talk about it, and here's what I did, and it really helped. And then you can try doing that. Or you can say, well, here's what I did, and it helped. Or here's what I did, and it didn't work. I do feel like the more people you can talk to who've been in your situation or are going to be, the better information you may have, and maybe you can help each other.
Yeah, that's good. And also talking to your spouse. And sometimes spouses don't always have those conversations with each other. My parents are a good example where my father did everything for my mother. She was a homemaker, and my dad, being an attorney, handled all the taxes and just everything. And so sometimes I guess you probably had clients who haven't had those conversations, or maybe one was kind of running the show.
Well, I'm a big believer in couples talking with each other about their finances and not leaving it all to one spouse. Now, there may be one spouse or partner who likes dealing with money more than the other. In my case, my wife doesn't care about investing, doesn't like it, and she allows me to be in charge of that. But I won't make a decision until I tell her what I'm thinking about and be sure that she's comfortable with that. And we're always ultimately in agreement, but I need to be the one to start that. And I'm fine with doing that. And she prefers that I do that. Where it really gets difficult is when the couples don't have these conversations at all, and one person does it all, and then they get a divorce, or one person dies, and then that other person is left in the cold, not knowing anything about their finances, what's been done, why it was done that way. I just feel like the more you can avoid that, the better off you're going to be.
Yeah, that's good advice. Well, the Hey Boomer Show is for all of us who are unretired or soon to be unretired and want to remain relevant and engaged. Some of the things we talked about today might have us feel more secure and less stressed about our financial future, thanks to Richard and your expert advice and experience. Can you give us, Richard, 2 or 3 takeaways you'd like to leave the audience with today?
Sure. I guess the first thing I would say is the sooner you can start having these conversations with your parents, with your grown children, with your siblings, with your spouse or partner, the better it's going to be for everybody. It may not be easy at first, but it's going to help you to start having these conversations. A lot of us procrastinate. We put it off because we know it's not going to be easy. It may not be pleasant, but it's really helpful to do it early and to, see whether your children or your parents have questions, things that they don't understand or don't know or want to know, or wishes that you didn't know that they want you to know, but they never told you before. It's a good time for you to say, we're thinking about downsizing, one day. And my wife and I were having this conversation just yesterday. When we move, we're not going to be able to take everything. We want to be sure that whatever we don't want can go to somebody who might want it. So we were just talking about, well, which of our sons might want this and which might want that. And we think we know, but we now need to ask them because, there may come a time where that's going to happen. And if neither of them want something, that's okay. But we want to be sure that we know that before we end up giving it to the wrong person.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Richard Eisenberg, you're a wealth of financial wisdom. Is there a place where people can follow you? I know we've had on the screen a couple of the websites that you're involved with, but is there a place you want to share with the audience that people can kind of follow your wisdom?
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, so I write for Next Avenue. That's nextavenue.org. That's a website for people over 50. I write personal finance and career stories there, but there are also great articles about health and caregiving and living. Then I also write for Market Watch, which is from Dow Jones. And there I write the view from unretirement in the retirement channel. They have a lot of other great writers writing about retirement and aging, and a lot about the stock market and personal finances too. So I would encourage your audience, if you could, to check out what I've been doing there and also check out what some of my colleagues are doing there.
Perfect. And I see on my notes here, you also have Richard Eisenberg at usa.net. So I guess someone could even send you a question if they wanted.
Yeah,
I don't want to deluge your inbox, but.
Well, that's my email address. I'm happy for anybody who wants to write to me If you have something you think I should be writing about, I'm always looking for good story ideas. If there's something I can do to be helpful, let me know. What I can't do is offer personal financial advice for anybody because I don't know their situation, but I'm happy to try to point you in the right directions if need be.
Well, I don't know about you, Wendy, but I'm sure you probably learned a few things today. I know I did.
Yeah, it was very useful. Thank you, Richard.
That was great.
I feel better.
What's that, Richard?
I just said feel better, Wendy.
Yeah, and thank you, John. I think you did a great job too.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I feel for you as I see you cough here and there. It's no fun getting bronchitis. Do you want to go over what's going to happen next week, or would you like me to cover that, Wendy?
Yeah, would you cover that, please?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you again, Richard. That was very interesting. Next week on the show, we are going to talk about the importance of having a financial plan. I know, Wendy, this is sort of like financial planning week or month, really. You kind of have a theme going, which I think is neat. Wendy's guest is going to be Quinton Pyle, a certified financial planner with Greenwood Capital in Greenville, South Carolina. Most of our adult lives, we thought about saving money. In retirement, we have to think about the best ways to withdraw money. And what are the tax implications? What about leaving an inheritance? And do we need to re-examine the insurance coverage we have? So come with questions next week. And for those of you who want to support Wendy as she recovers from her bronchitis, you can buy her a cup of coffee at the website buymeacoffee.com/HeyBoomer0413. This is a wonderful platform for creators and people who share work online. I know Wendy doesn't talk about it, but behind the scenes, there's a tremendous amount of work that goes into putting on a podcast and sharing interesting guests like Richard Eisenberg here on Hey Boomer. So it would be great if you could help support Wendy and her efforts with buymeacoffee.com/HeyBoomer0413. And there's also a private Hey Boomer What's Next Facebook group. You can email Wendy at wendy@heyboomer.biz, B-I-Z, and she can send you an invite to join the Facebook group. And we want to thank you for tuning in today. I know that everyone's time is valuable, and you chose to spend it with Hey Boomer, and thanks for putting up with a couple of our small technical audio problems. Richard did a great job of managing that. And Wendy, is there anything else you want to leave us with before we sign off today?
Yes, I want to tell everybody, live with passion, live with relevance, live with courage, and remember you're never too old to set another goal or dream a new dream. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, John. Great show. Appreciate it.